now after October 7 with the barbarism that happened from Hamas, and we see the testimony from the heads of universities, and you see the Ivy League schools unable to condemn speech that advocated genocide.
Right. But they will condemn speech if you don't use the right pronoun.
Exactly.
Right.
I mean, this is the upside down world of Orwellian neo-Marxism.
Mainstream media gives you the impression that there is nothing good about America. In direct contrast to that, my podcasts will prove by examples that America has always been and still is the land of opportunity for everyone.
Hello, and welcome to another episode in the series Life Lessons with me, Dr. Bob. My guest today is Zuhdi Jasser, a man who currently lives 3 lives and who wants to add yet one more. First, Zuhdi is a family man. He's a husband and a father of 3 children, living happily together in Arizona. His second life is as a physician. He is board certified in both internal medicine and nuclear cardiology, and he runs his own medical practice, the Jasser Center for Comprehensive Care in Phoenix. In his third life, he is the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, or AIFD. Any one of those 3 responsibilities could be a full-time job for most people, but not for Zuhdi. Although, as you'll see, he's a rather quiet man, he is filled with energy and is ready to add a 4th job to those 3. A few months ago, he announced that he's running for a seat in Congress representing District 4 in Arizona. Zuhdi is here today to discuss how he manages his current 3 roles and how he plans to add a 4th. Welcome to the show, Zuhdi.
It's great to be with you, Dr. Bob. Thank you for having me.
Sure. We don't have time to discuss all of the things that you do, so we'll skip over your role as a husband and father, even though raising a family is the most important role in every man's life. So let's start with your medical practice. I know that you earned your medical degree from the Medical College of Wisconsin on a Navy scholarship. Your father was a physician and your mother was a pharmacist, so I assume that you could have gone to medical school without joining the Navy. So why did you?
Well, I have to tell you, I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin, Neenah, Wisconsin, and my parents had escaped Syria in the mid-'60s and got asylum in the United States. I was born a few months after they got here. And growing up in that small town, I learned early on that I could practice my faith more freely, study what I wanted to in a way that my grandfather didn't have an opportunity to do, my father and mother did not, and the country, their motherland that they left in Syria, they abandoned and never wanted anything to do with that national identity because they wanted to be Americans. And that American identity, Americanism, as an ideology, if you will, or as Lincoln called it, the political faith of our community, was something I embraced and felt that we truly, as Reagan said, we're one generation away from losing. So I had 2 passions that I wanted to do in my life. One was to give back to my country, which was to join the military, but I also wanted to be a doctor. So the way I could marry those was to be a physician in the military and serve my country. And I'll tell you, the other thing I learned from my grandparents and my parents is that the special sauce in America is not only the foundational constitution and our social contract, but truly it's the fact that our military takes orders from our civilian government.
Mm-hmm. Which is not true in every country.
No, and this is, if you look in Syria, where the Assad regime, the father and the son, the Baathists, whether it was Saddam's Baathism or Assad's Baathism or Gaddafi or Mubarak or all of the dictators, the monarchs of the Gulf, they're tyrannical, and they truly have a concentrated deep state, and that deep state controls the economy, the government, and everything, and the presidents and the government are simply hand in hand with the military. So in the United States, what preserves our freedom is a military that protects the government from, of the people and for the people. And ultimately, I learned that my parents finally were able to express themselves in their personal faith in a way they couldn't in Muslim majority countries, because while they were Sunni Muslims who are majorities, their interpretation was a minority interpretation, and they were dissidents in many ways. My grandfather tried to modernize and have a democracy in Syria. He was an interior minister for a few years. Started a newspaper, which became Al Hayat newspaper, was a politician in Aleppo. But that lasted 4 years after the French pulled out. And they had coup after coup after coup because the people had no weapons. They had no means of defending themselves against a autocratic, fascistic military, and ultimately no freedom. So I felt that service in the military was a necessary part of me giving back to a country that gave my family freedoms. And I see all the people rushing into the country now, and I wonder, how are we letting this happen? Are they coming here because they want to be American, or they were trying to destroy America? And I wanted to give back to my country, and being a physician in the same way my father was an aspiration that I had.
Yeah, we'll certainly talk about immigration later because that affects the Southwest in Arizona. But first, tell us about the path that you took to running a successful medical practice today. From you entered, you finished college, medical school, you showed up at the Navy. What happened?
So my full story is in my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam. And in that story, I talk about how I first wanted to be an attorney, and I realized that as much as I love the law and the foundations in America, much of the day-to-day ins and outs of being an attorney to me seemed almost a majority of the work is antagonistic. As a physician, primary care to me was a passion in which you develop the closest relationships with folks, that you were not only providing a service as their provider and as their primary care quarterback, if you will, but it was a relationship that was long-term. It was developing a community. And to me, that was a profession that I wanted to embrace. And I wanted to go to medical school, and ultimately went to medical school on a fast track that allowed me to study philosophy in undergrad and start a newspaper at the University of Wisconsin and do other things because I had been accepted to medical school early. And then when I went to the Navy.
So do you get into medical school and then you apply to the Navy, or what is the process?
You have to have a letter of acceptance into the military. It's called the Health Profession Scholarship Program.
Yes.
And a program started in the early 70s by Nixon to increase recruitment of physicians into the military. Pays not only your tuition, but provides a stipend.
Ooh,
and
great.
Yes, I didn't have to do that. My parents were pretty well-to-do.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
But to me, service is about, ultimately one of my tours was serving in Operation Restore Hope. I joined my ship as a medical officer as it was returning from Somalia. And, in that tour, I realized that you really see in a volunteer force folks that are the best and brightest in our society that want to give back. I remember our deck officer was of the Jewish faith. My CO was Catholic. My XO was Protestant. Our supply officer was Mormon. I mean, we had a diverse faith community, diverse ethnic community, and we became extremely close friends during that deployment. And it was really because people were in the military that I got to know, because they wanted to preserve our freedoms. They wanted their families to be safe and not worry about losing their freedoms. And as a doctor, I also got to know them through sickness, through health, through all of their ups and downs and fears of disease and other things. And ultimately, I embraced primary care. While it's easy as a physician sometimes to say, oh, you want to do specialty medicine, that's a little more lucrative. To me, a primary care doc ultimately is the quarterback for all of your care. I'm still very old-fashioned in that regard. And I also specialized in studying bioethics. I run the bioethics program at a large hospital in Phoenix, Arizona, and have been teaching bioethics now for 25 years as an associate professor at the University of Arizona. And I realized that some of the toughest decisions families make, whether it's about organ transplantation, brain death, neonatal sickness in the ICU, abortion, life issues, all these kind of things that are related to life and death, we realize that 50% of the American healthcare dollars spent in the last 2 weeks of life. And those
Say that again?
50% of the
Of
trillions
all the
of
money.
dollars spent in healthcare is in the last 2 weeks of life. So with that amount spent, the fact that we have very few people walking our patients through some of these decisions, and it's just sort of done as reflexive in a very fragmented system, is something I wanted to try to fix. And I was raised in a way that, and this is why I went into primary care, was that I was taught to walk towards the fire to help people, to walk towards the coding patient, to walk towards the pandemic, to walk towards terrorism and counterterrorism, as we'll talk about. But ultimately, the vast majority are all more about creating chaos and conflict rather than trying to solve it and look at solutions. So that's part of what and when I left the Navy, I served for 11 years. I served aboard ship as a medical officer. I was chief resident at Bethesda Naval Hospital. I was on a fast track because I ended up being a physician to Congress. My last billet was working for Admiral John Isehold, who had 2 internists working for him, and I was one of the docs to the House and the Senate and the Supreme Court, and did that for 2 years.
And so you were on call when
Yep.
you're in that position?
Anytime the House was in session, we had to be there. On, for example, on July 24th, 1998, Russell Weston Jr. shot his way into the Capitol, killed 3 Capitol Hill police officers. It was literally 30 yards from our office. I was the only doc on duty. Me and 4 corpsmen ran towards the shooting. We were tackled by the police officers saying, hold on, he's still the shooter's at large. And we said we wanted to try to save these guys. They then let us try to resuscitate them. They got to George Washington Hospital. They succumbed from their injuries. But ultimately, that's the closest I've been personally, physically, to terrorism, was working on Capitol Hill as a physician. And I would not have traded that service for anything. I can't tell you how much I wish my grandfather had been alive to see, his grandson working for the democracy that he always just thought the world of. That's why my dad, his son, ended up coming to America. But then after those 2 years, I had finished my commitment, my 11 years, after finishing my scholarship commitment, and had an opportunity to join my dad in practice. My dad's partner, who was actually a leading primary care doc, conservative in the Jewish community in Phoenix, was my dad's partner, was retiring. And they recruited me and said, listen, we'd love you to join our practice. And it seemed to be the right time. So we overlapped for a year. I got to know all of his large practice. And I mentioned it was in the Jewish community because that was in 1999. So the year he retired was 2000. Only months later, 9/11 happens, and we had created a Children of Abraham, which was a Muslim-Jewish dialogue group that immediately became unbelievable friends as we started to navigate some of the post-9/11 environment. But as far as my medical profession, that was sort of a practice that had already been established that I joined, and my dad and I didn't want to. The reason I left the Navy was, one of the principles in my life as far as legacy is concerned is not wanting to have any regrets. And the relationship...
Should have, could have, would have.
Exactly. And the relationship I had with my dad was just amazing, in that I did not want to say that I wish I had been able to practice with my father. So for 5 years, practicing with him was amazing. He did get pretty ill in 2005. And wasn't able to practice anymore, and he passed in 2009, rest his soul. But that was just an amazing 5 years. It was sometimes, as much as it's great to work with your dad, but
there are
other
problems.
times there's challenges. And then after that, I was very involved in organized medicine in Arizona. I, within 5 years, became president of the State Medical Society, Arizona Medical Association.
When did you do your cardiology residency?
Yeah, so cardiology, I actually am a primary care internist. I got a board in nuclear cardiology working with my father as a cardiologist, and at the at Banner University there in Phoenix, taught nuclear cardiology, and within 2 years of working there was able to get boarded. So I'm not a cardiologist like the typical cardiologist. I do primary care internal medicine, but I have a niche in cardiac testing and nuclear imaging and stress testing.
I see. I never heard of nuclear cardiology. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so nuclear cardiology is the ability to test the heart as far as screening for coronary artery disease, cardiomyopathy or ejection fraction problems.
Arteriograms and those kind of things.
Using treadmill stress testing and looking for risk assessment, doing stress either by treadmill or by chemical stress. And what it allows you to do, and the reason I did that niche is having come from being a physician to Congress and executive medicine training, I think it fits very well in a primary care practice because the number one killer is heart disease and heart attacks. And unfortunately, most people don't get regular care from a cardiologist unless they have known heart disease.
Right.
So you want to be able to predict that first event. And I think a primary care practice that screens annually with treadmill testing per the American College of Cardiology recommendations and reduces risk factors like high cholesterol, high blood pressure, diabetes, smoking, weight, all the things that can contribute to heart disease is, I think, really a part and parcel of a very good executive professional primary care program.
I'll take the opportunity, because you do know a lot about hearts and cardiology. Statins are the most commonly prescribed drug, I think, in America today. And what is your view? For example, I was put on statins 20 years ago, even though my cholesterol was within the normal limits, but my physician at the time, who happened to be an endocrinologist, actually he was a kidney specialist, which is
nephrology.
He's a nephrologist. Put me on that because he told me, and it made sense to me, that it's incremental, that cholesterol builds up over time, and the sooner that you can lower your cholesterol, the better. Is that still the viewpoint on statins?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look, when I started in 99 with my dad, I probably had a patient going to bypass surgery and coronary disease surgical treatment every month, out of my 2,000-3,000 patients that I had. Now it's 4,000 or so. But at the time, now I probably have 1 or 2 patients at the most a year going to bypass surgery. And the number of patients needing stents has gone down. So, and stent is when you put a little piece of metal into the artery to open up the plaque that's building up. So I think a lot of that we credit statins with. And you're right, out of the top 10 medications, 4 or 5 are statins. Do they have a downside? Yeah, there's a little liver inflammation. Some people get muscle aches, etc. But the bottom line is there's large evidence-based research that shows that patients on statins have 4 to 5% less strokes, 5 to 10% less heart attacks. It depends on which studies you look at. So part of that comes from not necessarily, remember, cholesterol sort of gets a bad rap. Every cell membrane in your body is made out of the 27 carbon cholesterol molecule. But when it gets in excess, it builds up in the blood vessels and the arteries.
Okay.
And that excess is typically the LDL cholesterol that's on the plaque of your artery. So what happens is I've got patients in their 90s that their arteries are full of plaque. So why are they in their 90s? Why didn't they pass when they were younger? Well, their plaque was stable. It never cracked. So when a plaque cracks, it's like when you cut yourself, the clot forms on there. If a plaque cracks in an artery, it'll plug the whole artery and you lose that muscle that is providing you to get a heart attack. So statins make those plaques stable. They smooth them over so they're not as unstable, and reduces LDL, which is the main part of the cholesterol that goes into that plaque.
I had no idea about that. Very interesting. Yeah. Okay. Wasn't the main topic, or even close to the main topic, but took the opportunity. So after your father passed, you built the practice up. So now it's really a comprehensive organization that you run, the Jasser Center.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, is truly my passion. It's how I've made the vast majority of my income is in primary care. And we've got 5 providers in my clinic. 2 physicians, 2.5 physicians, one's part-time, and then 2 to 3, 2.5 mid-levels, which are physician assistants and nurse practitioners. We have a very
super.
Yeah, and we have the philosophy of my practice is that we're known as being sort of the comprehensive. I mean, we do not only head to toe, we don't leave a stone unturned. We usher patients through. It's like concierge medicine without having to pay the concierge. We're insurance-based practice. And I'll tell you, as a result, as being someone who really tries to solve the problems, as the president of the State Medical Society in 2007 and 2008, I was very engaged nationally in medical issues and sort of built a national footprint in the medical community. I was one of the 4 delegates from Arizona to the AMA and tried to work against Obamacare, which I saw in 2009 as the socialization of American medicine. And I still, to this day, have one of the few remaining. And as you may know, in medicine in the last 5 years, we've seen right now the number 1 employer of physicians is Optum, which hardly anybody knows what they do. It's like this behind-the-scene acronym that nobody knows what they do. You've seen private equity firms from Blackstone and on starting to buy up every dermatology, cardiology, specialist practice. And there's very few small business left, and which is one of the reasons I'm interested in getting in the political realm is because the institutions of America have started to form clots that are losing the loyalty to what built America, which is small business.
Small business.
And small business medicine. My dad's shingle of healthcare that they had is almost a relic of the past, but some of us will never let go of that. And there are many docs. I built after having been president of the State Medical Society, I then started a private practice section at the AMA, which truly was an insurgency. I mean, the AMA is not only left of center, they were pretty much in bed with Obamacare and other things. And yet we said, listen, some of us want to work within the House of Medicine, within this large lobby, just like there's the American Bar Association and all these other advocates for their professions. I worked within and said, listen, there are many of us that want to keep providing the option of private practice, small business medicine, where we have small businesses of less than 50 employees, less than 100, that are providing care, don't want to be part of a large insurance company or large hospital owned. And
just be an employee.
Exactly. And it provides better care because I'm only 1 degree of separation from my practice manager versus you go to the large clinics, they end up becoming like pilots. You know, I don't have anything wrong with pilots, but they forget that the brand on the door is their brand when they're providing the care to the patient. And that's been lost in American medicine. And there are a few doctors in Congress, and many of them are from small business practices. And so that's sort of been the mantra that I've pushed nationally is we formed a private practice physician section in the AMA, which now includes almost 15% of the delegates nationally, which is a good plurality.
Surprise.
It's growing. And after the pandemic, now they've come to embrace us because they realize that over 40%, Dr. Bob, over 40% of primary care practices are starting to shut down and will be shut down in the next 2 years
because
after
of
the
government
pandemic.
Regulation.
Because of the pandemic, because of the lack of, I mean, during the pandemic, the insurance companies became banks. Remember, people were paying all the same premiums. All the elective procedures stopped. Most of the consumption in medicine went away. While, yes, there was an increase because of pandemic illness, ICU care, but it was a small drop in the bucket. And while the hospitals were also in the insurance business, many of them, they banked a ton of money. And while many of us on the front lines, I never shut my doors for 1 day, not for 1 day during the pandemic. And yet, while we were working our tails off, we still didn't have 100% output because a lot of the elective visits, physicals were down. People weren't coming. So we were about 70, 80% of what we typically were.
Well, this is very interesting. And they collected from individuals or from companies premiums without changing the premium.
Exactly.
Whereas, I don't know if you know this, the auto insurance companies, at least the ones that I did business or do business with, they sent me money back. they actually, I don't know if it was only in California, but they said because people are driving less, the risk is much less. Here's money back on your policy.
Exactly. And
right? And that could have happened or should have happened with medical insurance.
Yeah.
It should have happened.
And
they could have used that money to help finance those practitioners who were not making enough money because nobody's going to the doctor.
And I was screaming that from the rooftops on Newsmax, on Fox, on
Good
radio
point.
in Arizona. And I can't tell you how much of a minority I was, a minority voice, even within medicine, because the employed docs, the other institutions of the metaglomerates, I call them, were basically, spending money like a drunken sailor, as we used to say in the Navy, and they didn't really, they were focused on one disease, one virus, and all the other disease trading was forgotten. It didn't matter. This is why, to me, primary care is not just about my one patient, right? In ethics, there's microethics at the bedside and there's macroethics. And our society, and this is sort of my trajectory of 25 years now in practice, is I've seen the macroethics of primary care as a community. Our American foundations of civic contributions, our social cohesion has fallen apart. It's gone. So who's taking care of our community from its political health, from its social health, familial health, economic health? All these things seem to be nobody's looking at the big picture, and that somehow there's a reason the family unit is the unit ordained by the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, because things don't work when they get too big. The family unit is the, and it's just like your body. The cell is a cell. You can't enlarge it. The organ can't exist without cells working individually. And in our society, if we forget the family unit, if we forget the primary care aspect of taking care of the family, our society will fall apart in one generation, and that's what's happening. And my practice, thankfully, has continued to grow. We've provided a lot of consultation, not only for my patients, but for the communities, for bioethics, and working with different hospitals and things like that.
I'm very impressed that you can maintain still a private practice growing with all the regulations necessary, and the billing is so complex, right? You must, how do you handle bills? They come in. Some people have co-payments, not co-payments. I know these big institutions, UCSD or Scripps here, they have whole departments that handle the billing. So I'm so impressed that you're able to do all that, because there's and then there's malpractice insurance and litigation you have to worry about. And that's why I think many doctors say, forget it. I'm just going to, go to one of these large health organizations and be an employee and not worry.
Well, your question hits the nail on the head, which is, why are there any of us left in private practice? And I'll tell you, the recent studies that we helped stimulate in private practice, we actually launched some national studies, which is why many of them are waking up. Do you know that despite the fact that our list of complaints is 5 times longer than the employed doctors, our burnout rate is a half less? And the reason is I'm trying to think of a
greater
cleaner
satisfaction.
It's not only satisfaction; it's the fact that you'd rather sit in your own waste, than have it dropped on by people you work for. And that's human nature. That's why America is the most successful country in the world, because our medical science has advanced, our free markets have advanced. Free markets are the engine for creativity. Socialism will kill every country that it takes over. So the bottom line is many of us prefer to make half the income of our employed colleagues, because I can decide that I want to spend some time on my nonprofit. I can spend this time with my family.
It's up to you.
I can work. Right now, as I'm launching my campaign, I have some days I do a night clinic, and I've got my mornings open. I shift things the way I want them. I can hire people to do things. I mean, you decrease the degrees of separation so that you have more satisfaction. Now, the complaints are much more. The unfunded mandates that the government shoves down my throat are unbelievable. And
unfunded meaning you have to take care of people without getting paid.
they think I'm getting paid, but they pay me one global fee for a visit, which is $100, let's say, and then it includes all the prescriptions later, all the phone calls, all the billing, everything else is in one global fee, which then breeds corruption in some practices because they say they did this and this, even though they cut corners in other things. So it's not truly fee for service. It's a global payment system that supposedly checks all the boxes, and yet the hospitals have a site service differential. So the hospital across the street from my office can get paid 4 times as much as I do for a nuclear stress test because they are supposedly being subsidized for charity care because they have to. I don't have to take care of people that don't have insurance. I often do, but I don't have to, while emergency rooms and hospitals do.
So that justifies a 4 times increase?
It doesn't. So what you need to do is, if the members of Congress understood what was going on, you'd say, okay, subsidize that directly.
I understand.
But don't inflate other payments.
Right. That
and then
doesn't
say
make sense.
because that's why now hospitals are buying practices and doing all these other things, because they shift profit shifting and create profit centers based on things that they get paid tons for. And we can't do that. And we're providing the same service. This is why some of the billing about some of the bills about, transparent billing and no surprise billing that was tried to be passed a few years ago is about really letting Americans know about really how much things should cost in medicine and what the actual prices are from a hospital compared to what we do in our practices.
Right. I know that I was going to go in for an MRI, but the insurance required that I do all sorts of physical therapy first, MRI of my back or something. And with the hospital, I said, I'll pay it out of pocket. They said, well, our charge is $2,500 for an MRI, but if you go to this private practice, there are all these private organizations that will do MRIs, $500. So it's a huge disparity between what you should pay at a private practice and what the hospital is charging for.
We were trying to explain to national folks, including physicians, that part of the reason all these private equity firms are buying medical practices and hospitals are buying them, Optum's buying them, is to avoid Stark laws. Stark legislation says that you can't self-refer, meaning that if I invest as a primary care doc in a radiology place,
I see,
I can't refer my patients there.
I see,
because I'm making income.
But if you own it,
if it's part of one big company, and it's a hospital owned by admin people and not by physicians, then you can do it.
I see. I understand.
Which is an anti-physician, anti-patient legislation, and they go around it by absorbing other companies.
All right, let's talk about another problem I see happening in medicine: DEI. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. At what that means in colleges, at admissions, people have the admissions office or the DEI expert at the university says you have to hire people who are underrepresented at schools today. Now, there's a reason why they're underrepresented, because probably they didn't meet the criteria. That's why certain groups of people are underrepresented in anything. I mean, little people are underrepresented in football because they can't play football. You need big people. So now DEI is requiring schools are automatically lowering the standards, medical schools, let's talk about, lowering the standards for acceptance into medical school. And that means less qualified people are going to become doctors.
I have to tell you, this is another one of the, call it culture wars, call it, I think Andrew Breitbart, who was a friend of mine before he passed so early, used to say, politics is always downstream of culture. And the neo-Marxists, the extreme lefts, have always been, this is one of the things as a conservative that I've always been so upset with my movement about, is that we're always playing defense, and B, we're not thinking 10, 20 years down the road in the mobilization of our activists. This DEI stuff did not hatch itself around the pandemic, and now all of a sudden it's coming out.
It started in the 60s.
It started decades ago. It's an Orwellian doublespeak. It has nothing to do with diversity, equity, or inclusion, because ultimately, as conservatives, we are actually the colorblind movement. We are the ones who say it should be about meritocracy. It should be about what are the skill sets and true competition, so that our best and brightest, regardless of skin color or background or ethnicity, whatever it is. But no, the far left now has weaponized skin color, has weaponized racial origin in order to actually be, and what they use is, and this is what I was testifying to Congress about on the terrorism issue when they deal with Muslims, is a bigotry of low expectations. Is that when there was an op-ed written by a physician in the Washington Post, actually, African-American physician, who said, it's interesting, these DEI programs, she said in her op-ed, and I'm paraphrasing, she said, I've never felt discrimination from my colleagues or from the institution. She said, occasionally I'll feel discrimination from a patient that comes in and doesn't want a African-American physician to take care of them. And my institution has stood behind me and said, this is your doctor, So it's interesting that actually, if you talk to folks that have been practicing and succeed and aren't part of the blame others or the victim-obsessed mindset, they'll tell you that, no, it's not about the institution that has to apologize for itself. And even organizations like the AMA and others are now starting out meetings where they read from it. It almost becomes cultish, where they're reading a phrase that says, "We start this meeting because it's on stolen land." Which is a neo-Marxist phrase that actually isn't just about the American Indian experience. It's done in countries all over the world where the Marxists get hold of things, and it's actually such a educational thing to see that physicians who are smarter than this, who are supposedly the top of the educational academic rungs in America, are just blindly accepting a cultish behavior in which nobody can disagree with this. Nobody can say, well, this doesn't make any sense. This isn't who we are. Maybe it happened 10 generations ago, but that's not what I think. And I'm not going to apologize for things my great whatever might have done. It's just not American. So, and the Supreme Court has ruled against it. The Supreme Court recently came up with a very clear ruling that affirmative action is un-American. It doesn't apply to the Constitution, and that we should not prefer people based on skin color or ethnic origin, and that it should be a meritocracy. And they're going to have to reevaluate all of that. And then they're wondering now, after October 7, with the barbarism that happened from Hamas, and we see the testimony from the heads of universities, and you see the Ivy League schools unable to condemn speech that advocated genocide.
Right. But they will condemn speech if you don't use the right pronoun.
Exactly.
Right.
I mean, this is the upside down world of Orwellian neo-Marxism, where clearly, and by the way, I support America's historical defense of the ability for people to publicly speak hate speech. And the reason I support that is you want that to be exposed so that it can be treated with the antiseptic of sunlight, versus what you see in Europe, where hate speech is pushed underground and it boils and it prevents.
If you try to deny hate speech, then you have to define it, and it can't be defined.
But
currently it's defined as you hurt somebody's feelings, so you can't say
exactly. And then they start with this super slippery slope of incitement.
Right.
And I will tell you, the Brandenburg versus Ohio decision with the KKK, in which they said that what is incitement is when you directly call for the murder or the killing of somebody. But hate speech, as far as racism, etc., that's free speech.
It's allowed.
And calling for genocide, the wiping out of Israel from the river to the sea, and the inability for a president of Penn State, of Harvard, to openly say that genocide would be prohibited, that is incitement directly.
One of them said, and I forget which one, well, if it leads to that action, then it's hate speech. They actually said that. And she says, what? They have to commit genocide in order for the speech to be hate speech? Other than that, it's not hate speech. So and I'm sure you're referring to Elise Stefanik, who is a congresswoman. I forget what state she's from.
New York.
But I immediately, after watching that presentation, went to the website and made us a nice donation. And she called me on Monday, the next Monday. I'm going to be on her team. She is, if not for her, this wouldn't have surfaced. Because all the people who questioned those professors ahead of time didn't make the same point that Elise Stefanik did. And when she said, now I'm going to ask you again, the second time, I'm going to give you another chance to answer this, yes or no. Does this violate your university's statements and policies on speech, on free speech or hate speech? Well, it all depends on context, I see.
And this is the fertile soil of radicalism that's been radicalizing the left in the last, not only since the riots and the Black Lives Matter movement during the pandemic, but even before that, is that they created this undercurrent of being defensive, that somehow we need to apologize for being American. And to me, there's a deep racism, there's a fascism in that, in which they hold certain communities to lesser standards. And we see President Gay herself is no longer, they're not saying she committed plagiarism, they're saying she had duplicate some kind of duplication of verbiage
or something, or didn't give
that's
correct
bigoted.
reference.
I mean, why say that that's duplication
but yet
when
I think
somebody else commits it, they're corrupt?
The records are going to show in the investigation that 20 students had been fined or thrown out of school for this.
Yes.
Okay. But not the president of Harvard.
If I was African American, I'd be insulted.
Insulted by her.
That I'm going to now be looked upon as somebody who's held to a lower standard. And as a Muslim American Muslim, this is why I've been so outspoken about radical Islam and political Islam, because I want to earn people's respect.
With them.
Not only do I not want to be associated with it, I don't want people to give me a pass because I'm Muslim and be worried about being called Islamophobes or bigots. And this is the undercurrent that's been brewing in America, in which the Islamists are working hand in hand with the DEI folks and the neo-Marxists. It's called the Red-Green Axis. The Red-Green Axis started globally with the Venezuelas of the world, working with Iran, with the Chinas of the world, working with the Islamists of Hamas and Hezbollah and all these others, in which they together demonize the West, demonize free society, demonize Israel. That's why the UN spends all of its time focusing on Israel, the only true democracy in the Middle East.
One. Right. And
they focus on them because the red-green axis is globally, it has the macro effects at the UN of being anti-Western, anti-freedom. Microscopically, granular in the on the streets, it's the Ilhan Omars of the world working with AOC, the far left progressivists.
Zuhdi, let's move on to another organization that you spend a lot of time with, and that's being the leader, the head, the founder of AIFD, the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, that you started by yourself in 2003, exactly 20 years ago. Now, I searched the web and discovered that there are literally hundreds of Muslim organizations in the United States. Given that there are so many, why did you start another one?
Well, it's not just another one. The ones that exist, the alphabet soup of Western Muslim organizations, I would prefer to call them not Muslim, but Islamist organizations. So
that's with an IST at the end.
Yes, IST. So Islamist is a term that's just like communist or socialist. It's a theopolitical movement that believes that their platform is about setting up Islamic states with an Islamic identity, in which the Constitution is the Quran, and in which clerics are legislators. That's Islamism. So the Muslim Brotherhood is an Islamist party. Hezbollah, Hamas are Islamist parties off the Brotherhood. Hezbollah is off the Khomeinists in Iran. Khomeinists running all of Iran are Islamist. So ultimately, the Western formation of activist Muslims has been 95% Islamist groups because of Petro Islam. Petro Islam is the Islam that has been fueled by the billions, by petrodollars from Saudi Arabia for decades. It finally came to a stop in 2017 under the Trump administration. Not a full stop, but mostly. And from Qatar especially, Turkey is still part of the petro-Islamic dollars. And bottom line is that has supercharged and gave a inordinate representation of political Islam among Muslims. And as a doctor, I said, listen, I don't treat symptoms. I want patients not to have complaints, but I treat disease. You don't cure a cough by just suppressing the cough. You treat the pneumonia, you treat the lung cancer. The lung cancer here in the Islamic world, which is a quarter of the world's population. We're not talking about just one small thing. So Islamism is the same disease, whether it's Pakistan's Islamic Party that is trying to run their country, or whether it's the Al-Qaeda's of Saudi Arabia, or whether it's the Hamas's of the Palestinians, or whether it's ISIS's of Syria or Iraq. It's all the same cancer, which is political Islam and Islamism. So AIFD was basically formed not as another Muslim organization, but as a modern Muslim, postmodern Muslim organization that believes in Enlightenment principles, that is Western predominantly as far as its ideas, its belief in the individual over the tribe, its rejection of tribalism, its rejection of collectivism, its rejection of socialism, all of these tribal ideologies that are part of Islamism, which is why Islamists work so great with the far left, because they're also collectivists. We believe that as Muslims, we need to start building institutions that are based in individual human rights and American constitutional republic principles. Separation of mosque and state basically is our mission. And that's the nuclear antidote to political Islam, is preventing the establishment of religion and government. And that's why Americanism is and that's goes back to where we started, which is why I'm so pro-American and why I love this country. It's the antidote. It's why I'm not an Islamist. The only thing I die for is America. I would never want to die for my faith. I have a great relationship with God, but the faith community doesn't need me to die for it. That's everybody's, it's a personal relationship between them and God. But I would die for my country because without this country, my kids won't have a place to practice the faith the way they want to interpret it. Without this country, we won't have a school system that teaches them freedom and academic meritocracy and all the things we were talking about that the neo-Marxists are trying to destroy every institution that's free. So the alphabet soup of Islamic organizations is not about preserving the West or reforming Islam. It's about destroying it from within. It's about giving the Islamic regimes room to put the West on defense so that they can spread into Europe, into the West, and weaken us and weaken our ideas. So I have a podcast called Reform This, in which I talk about a lot of the issues of where the inflection points are between the West, between freedom and democracy versus Islamism. And we see this in the DEI programs. We see it in a lot of the areas in which the Islamists have been working hand in glove. I mean, you look at the groups, it's not just CARE, it's groups like Students for Justice in Palestine, which their website has advocacy for terrorism on it. They should be looked at under material support for terrorism.
And they shouldn't be allowed to have representation in colleges. Exactly. And any foreign student who signs up to belong to those organizations which support terrorism should be thrown out of this country.
Exactly.
And that's what President Trump said he would do. Exactly. He said, I'm going to revoke those student visas.
And listen, as a Muslim, you're either dishonest or you are trying to deceive the West into the realities that we have a problem. Islam is 1,444 years old. And if you look, Christianity and a lot of the West went through some massive reforms at that age. And the establishment, and this is why I so much appreciated, a lot of the Trump movement, is that the establishment in America was a problem. And that's what Trump was fighting. As an American Muslim, I have the opportunity here to fight the establishment in the Muslim community globally.
From within, yeah.
And the establishment in the Muslim community is a cancer. They are working in the 13th century mentality. They are not only misogynistic, they are anti-freedom, they're anti-Semitic, they're bigots. They will do everything to take away property rights and human rights. and they will fuel barbaric movements like Hamas and others in order to keep people at bay as slaves of their state. And they do
Well,
it
the term Islam means submission, I understand.
submission to God. This is why we want to reform.
Right.
Is because
It should be submission to God, but not submission to prelates.
Exactly. And as a libertarian-minded person, I would say you want to live in a laboratory of freedom so that God can know that I had a choice to drink or not drink, to commit sins or not commit sins. It's not the imam's role to create a sanitized society. You need to live in freedom so that people can be judged by God, whether we actually followed the faith or
and
not.
not have religious police.
Exactly.
Beating women because they're not quite covered.
And that's what the West went through in its Reformation, was to separate the establishment of religion from the government.
Big step.
And this is why the word Christian doesn't appear in our founding documents. It's under God, absolutely. It's a religious society, which I embrace. I'm not anti-religious. I disagree with sort of the French mentality of laïcité, which is a hyper-secularism. So I do think the American experiment is the one that I think is the best democracy on the planet.
That's why we've been number one in the world for quite a long time. But that's at risk. Now, there's an organization that you referred to called CAIR, C-A-I-R, Council on American Islamic Relations. And that's the organization that gets most of the press. Whenever there's an issue about Islam to be discussed, the press, the media run immediately to CAIR for information. Why is that? Why don't you have a seat at that table?
That's a great question. Couple things. So first is the fact that the Council on American Islamic Relations, which as the Holy Land Foundation trial that put all of their board members, I think, in jail for supporting Hamas back in 2008 because they were funding Hamas contrary to American law.
Yes. Because Hamas then, even and still now, is identified as a terrorist organization.
Exactly. So CAIR was basically Hamas in 1993. They had a Philadelphia meeting that the FBI documents showed that they're a unindicted co-conspirator in that trial. And Nihad Awad, Omar Ahmed, a lot of the founders were basically Palestinian immigrants that came here in order to use Western freedoms to found this organization. They found that they got limited traction on their Palestinian cause because they originally were the Islamic Association of Palestine. They then transformed their name into supposedly caring about all Muslims, and they basically began a hijacking of the Muslim community into the Palestinian movement. No different than if you look, every Arab Muslim dictator, when they're on the ropes, start caring about Palestinians. Saddam Hussein did it as the American army was invading Baghdad. He started saying he cared about Palestinians, etc. You see Al Jazeera from Qatar do it all the time, demonizing the West based on the Palestinian issue. CAIR supposedly is about the rights of Muslims. They fabricate a lot of the issues that are related to Muslim freedoms in America, in which we are actually not as much at risk as they think we are. They ignore the actual groups that are at risk, like the Jewish community that have many more incidents of anti-Semitism and other embedded real bigoted incidents that occur. But they use victimization in order to deflect the reality of our responsibility of what we as American Muslims should be focusing on, which is countering radicalization. And, I've gone head to head with them in debates, not only in national media, but at mosques. And it came to a head in 2011 when Peter King from New York was chair of the Homeland Security Committee in the House, had hearings on radicalization in the Muslim community. And he had myself, Ezra Nomani, and a number of other Muslim leaders that are reformists that we had built in our Muslim reform movement testify to what's wrong with the CAIRs of the world, why they were actually radicalizing our community, and how the Nidal Hassans of the world, who was a army doctor, was working with Al-Qaeda while he was supposedly treating patients at Walter Reed, carrying around a card that he said he was soldier of Allah, and then murdered 14 people at Fort Hood, injured 35, and was an Al-Qaeda operative that was talking to imams around the world that were targeting America. So how does this radicalization happen? He came from a Palestinian family that had actually attended some CARE events in Washington. And I talk about this in my book, how the conveyor belt of radicalization doesn't just start all of a sudden where the Nidal Hassans of the world one night is a nice psychiatrist and the next day is a radical Al-Qaeda guy. It starts with, you're a victim, DEI. It starts with, okay, once you're a victim, then you...
Who's the enemy?
Who's the enemy? Who's the villain? America's the problem. They hate us. Then you must attack them. You must protect your family. And the only way to do it is by asynchronous warfare. And then you become a soldier and you become a jihadi. And then you commit an act of terror and you work with the operatives globally. This is how radicalization happens. The first step, which is where the largest pool is Council on American Islamic Relations, Muslim Public Affairs. A lot of these organizations that are Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups are what really, if you really want to, it's like working against drug abuse. You can work against the heroin addicts that have needles in their arms, or you can work against those who start using marijuana, alcoholism, other drugs that are gateway drugs into. The gateway drug into radical Islam and Al-Qaeda is political Islamic organizations.
And regarding Nidal, was it Nidal Hassan?
Yeah.
A lot of the people who work with him had been reporting his behavior and the fact that he had all sorts of propaganda material against the United States in his office. And it was those people were told to shut up. That's okay. He's really one of us. It's free speech.
I not only testified to Congress about that, I wrote a piece in the National Review with Seth Leipzig, who's now chairing my campaign, and we wrote about the fact that it's a crime that the FBI report about Nidal Hassan, 180 pages, barely has his name twice. The word jihad is not in there. The word Islamist is not in there. The word terrorism is found a few times, but all these terms, now we can't even use the word terrorism in our military academies in 2023 because it might offend Muslims. It doesn't make any sense. So we were writing about this before anyone even knew what the word wokeism was, before anybody, I was being canceled before it was cool to be canceled. So this is all something that for those of us that have been working against the establishment within Washington for a while and have street cred with this.
Well, you've built up a nice following, and people now understand how brave you were 20 years ago talking about this. So it's appropriate, I think, for you to take the next step in your career, which is to run for Congress. And let's talk about that. You just recently announced a run for the 4th District, to be a representative in Congress from the 4th District in Arizona. Given your busy life, what was the catalyst that made you decide to run for Congress?
So, as I mentioned to you before, legacy and no regrets is a theme to my life. And the third part I'll get to is also the fact that at the end of the day, you look at media, you look at attention in America, and a lot of it ends up being driven by what's happening in Washington. And you look around the world, politicians, legislators end up taking a lot of the oxygen of activist work. And yes, the activists are important to build the initial infrastructures, but the priorities of what is set for the agenda of the bully pulpit, is set by our politicians, by our especially our federal politicians that are elected, both for Congress, Senate, and in the White House.
And what's important about supporting people like you, because you earned a living. You went to college. You didn't become a lawyer. Most politicians, their background is in law. And law produces very little except arguments. That's what law produces and settlements. But you're a productive member of our society, highly productive, and common sense. You've met payrolls, which most of these people never have done. Bernie Sanders, who came close to being the nominee for president in a recent election, never had a job. And we're talking about AOC. Her highest level of accomplishment was being a bartender. And now she's on various committees, finance committees. This woman can't add to numbers, I imagine, in her head. You deserve a tremendous amount of credit and support for your willingness to do the very difficult thing, run for office.
Thank you. And the guy I believe I will defeat in November, Congressman Greg Stanton, as you're basically hinting. He's somebody who has never held a real job. He's been a politician ever since he left law school. He was Phoenix mayor for 6 years, and now he's been congressman since then. I'm sorry. The traditional setup of what American democracy was supposed to be was supposed to be a civic service of folks that understood first in their first chapters of their life, first the educational system, then the business system. And as you said, for 25 years, I got paid after I paid everybody else. My check was the last one that got written. And I understood what it was like to try to keep employees or lose employees or gain the best employees. I understood what it's like during now in an inflationary economy. As I go around the district and talk to voters, I can look them in the eye and say, listen, I've been trying to keep a payroll while my inflation's going up. The pay I have to pay my employees goes up. My insurance payments that I get paid are fixed. They can't change because I have a fixed fee schedule that whether it's Blue Cross, United, Medicare, all of the fee schedules are fixed. So as inflation goes up, supplies cost me more. I can't change my prices.
But all of your expenses are going up.
Yep. So that's why during the pandemic and since now with inflationary economy under Biden, my pay's gone down 30-40%.
I believe it.
So
I believe it. Yeah,
this is the current members in Congress, especially the guy I'm going to displace and defeat, has no idea.
Okay, so let's talk about the issues in that district, because I forget which politician said it. All politics is local.
Yep.
And what are you going to do for the people, or what are you telling the people in your district who you want to vote for you? What are their issues?
So number one, it's economy. Yeah. We have to have a growth economy. This administration, the Biden administration, and Greg Stanton, the current congressman, has been a rubber stamp, 100% voted with the Biden administration. He doesn't even, I don't think, read the bills. He just signs what the way they tell the minority leader tells him to do, and he just signs it. So economic growth. Second is border, sealing the border, unleashing our border patrol so that they can provide. We don't have to write new laws. The laws are on the books,
of course,
to seal our border and stop the hemorrhaging and begin vetting. We have a very detailed policy for border security, because the border security is not just about people coming into this country that want nothing to do with Americanism but simply want to destroy our institutions. It's also about the drugs coming in. I can't tell you how many of the people in our district, Dr. Bob, are horrified by the amount of crime increase we've seen in the last year, horrified by the fentanyl that's coming in, that's laced with the gummy bears laced with fentanyl, and the drug use that's gone up, the trafficking, the sex trafficking, all of the thing that is associated with a unhinged border. Our national defense has been weakened. Our military academies are now part of the DEI initiatives, and we've lost our global superiority that is part of our national security. And I will tell you, if you look under the Trump administration, bless his heart for trying to seal the border, but it wasn't sealed. And even when it wasn't sealed, we had minimal amount of people coming across compared to what we see now. Why? Because the message from the White House, and this is why federal leaders have a bully pulpit role. And I love, my favorite example of this is Natan Sharansky. In his book, he said he knew he was going to be free from a Soviet prison when he read in a newspaper they handed him that Reagan had called the Soviet Union the evil empire. You can stop the hemorrhaging of our border from Biden to the members of Congress by simply daily reminding the world that we are not their garbage can. They cannot send anybody into the United States. It has to be people that want to be American, and they can't go through 4 countries and then claim asylum.
Right.
So all of these laws exist on the book, and we need to tell them we are going to enforce every one of them, and nobody can come here illegally. That would immediately stop the spigot. There's people, most of them aren't even from Mexico. They're from all over the Western
world.
Africa
Right.
and Eastern, wherever it might be. This is part of the role of federal leaders and what I would do, and I think our district is telling me they want to hear. Fourth is education reform. I think school choice and we find public education system has been a disaster without appropriate competition. And lastly, I think the social cohesion issue is really important, where we see free speech destroyed as an institution. And, you look at national sovereignty, Dr. Bob. National sovereignty is not only about borders, but it's about our consciousness. And our consciousness has abandoned the ability to have free speech. In the pandemic, you couldn't criticize vaccines, masks. You couldn't criticize Fauci or anything without having your ideas removed. We turned into what I thought my parents escaped in Syria. And our members of Congress, other candidates running for office, never seem to speak out about this.
It takes bravery. It takes people who are committed to saving this country, and I think you're one of those people. The Republican primary will be held next August, and you're running against two other candidates, Kelly Cooper and Dave Giles. How are you going to beat Cooper? And then let's talk about how you're going to beat Giles. Oh, take the easy one first.
Yeah, so Giles, he's been on the ballot, I think, the last 4 cycles and doesn't have much of a campaign or a following. So, we'll wait to see if he generates a campaign this time. But we can take that on once it formulates itself. Kelly Cooper was the nominee last time. He won the primary by a few thousand votes. But then lost in the district by 12 points. I don't know him that well. He's a small businessman, owns a couple restaurants. And bottom line is that in a district, let me give you a little demographic. The district is 51% Democrat, 49% Republican by registration, by voters, I'm sorry. By registration, it's 37% Republican, 25% Democrat, with a huge plurality of remaining independents. Those independents have leaned Democrat, which is why it's 51-49 in voting.
But that's in the past.
In the past. It was redistricted to these numbers in 2020. And in 2020, a Republican Governor Ducey, won it by 6 points. And a Republican Secretary of State won it by 4 points, Kimberly Yee. So this is a district that has voted Republican with the right candidates. And I would tell you that as somebody who's not run for office before and with a resume that's included not only serving my country, but serving the community. I have thousands of patients from Tempe and Mesa, where our district is, and have, I think it's one thing to be a business owner. It's another thing when you're a primary care doc and you get to know the families and all their struggles and so I'm not only the business owner, but I've been providing the service to tens of thousands, literally, of patients in that district. So I know their plight, I know their concerns, and also I'm vetted. I've been, battle tested, battle scarred. This is not a candidate. I think if there were things that would hurt the election, it would have come out.
That's right.
CARE would have released it 10 years ago.
That's right.
And they tried to do that, and nothing stuck because the people in Arizona know me. And I think at the end of the day, voters also want transparency in their elected officials. And people know that I've been transparent about the realities in my own faith community and in my medical community. And they also want people who have courage and that I'm going to walk towards the fire. And they know that nobody knew in 2019 that in 2020 we were going to be faced with a global pandemic. But they wanted people that they elected that they knew would walk towards it, not away from it, and not just worry about getting reelected. And I can make a promise to them, and I think that's a candidate that Greg Stanton has never had run against him in the last 3 cycles.
A key element from what little I know about elections is getting the vote out. All these polls of people who are one side or another, you could take a poll, but the key element is, are they going to show up and vote? And I think building a ground game and people to make sure that the people that you want to go out and vote are getting out and voting. And so I urge you to make sure that I think there's a lot of money you have to spend on TV, on radio, on meeting people, but reserve some money to make sure you have taxis, vans, or whatever to take people to the polls.
Absolutely. Right now, our primary priority is petitions, is getting the signatures we need to get on the ballot. We launched our campaign, formally filed at the end of September, and announced October 10th. I have.
You're not on the ballot yet?
Yes.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, but the petitions need to be signed in order to officially get on the ballot by April. So we're officially announced, but officially on the ballot, no. That happens in April.
Okay.
By the deadline, end of March, to get the signatures. So, but nobody's on the ballot until the end of March once the ballot gets formulated.
I see.
So,
I see. Okay.
But I will tell you that our goal is ultimately not only to do the grassroots into every legislative district in the federal congressional district, but it's to also listen to the voters, to have a listening tour, to find out what are the issues that are so key to them. Because as you said, all politics are local, and there are sometimes many issues that folks may not be aware of that should be high on our priority list. And listen, my experience globally has been to build coalitions. I built a coalition called the Clarity Coalition, which stands for Champions for Liberty Against the Reality of Islamist Tyranny. And we brought folks in the Muslim, non-Muslim community in Europe, Canada, and the U.S. together, some feminists, some gay rights activists, including conservatives and others, to build a coalition to protect and save the West. I'm going to take that same skill sets to my district on the ground level, and already I can't tell you the number of independents, folks in the Democratic Party that are asking me, hey, can I sign your petition? I'm like, well, you need to be Republican, but you can vote for me, in November. So, we're going to get past the primary. We're going to defeat Kelly Cooper, because I think the Republican voter realizes that they need to elect a candidate that can beat Greg Stanton, that can win. And Kelly Cooper last time lost by 12 points in a district that's split down the middle.
Now, to win the nomination, do you have to get more than 50% or just get more than the next person down the list?
You have to get more than the next person. So there's no runoff process.
Okay. Okay.
So right now there's 3 of us on the ballot. And with Kelly Cooper, I absolutely, as we get our ground game out in the next few months, he'll be beatable.
Good. Well, Zuhdi, I want to thank you for spending time with me today. And I want to thank you for 2 more things. First, for having the courage as a devout Muslim to expose political Islam as a danger to democracy. And you've been doing that for 20 years. And next, I want to thank you for spending your time, energy, and money to run for political office in order to reverse the ongoing decay of our culture caused by leftists and Marxists.
Thank you, Dr. Bob.
If you want to learn more about Zuhdi's efforts to oppose political Islam, you can go to the website aifdemocracy.org, aifdemocracy.org, all one word. And if you want to help Zuhdi win a seat in Congress, you can go to the website z4az.com. That's zforaz.com. I've gone there, and I'm going to support Zuhdi Jasser. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this episode of Life Lessons with Dr. Bob, please subscribe and you'll automatically be notified of future podcasts in the series.
Thanks so much for listening to another episode of Life Lessons with Dr. Bob. If you enjoyed these interviews with some of today's most influential thought leaders, please follow and rate the show on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget, you can also watch each episode on YouTube as well. We'll see you next time.
Hey, thanks for tuning in. I appreciate reading your comments on YouTube and social media, and now you can submit your questions on my website as well. Head over to lifelessonswithdrbob.com and click the question tab at the top of the page or the one on the right side of the screen, and let us know what's on your mind. I'll answer your questions at the beginning of each episode, so let it rip. Let's have some fun.